Well, good morning and welcome to our fall trimester here. Starting off a new set of classes this week, and I'm glad you decided to join us here. We are, as it says on the screen, and you'll be getting in your handouts, and as it was in the announced in the news and notes, we are going to be studying three books, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth here. And I will tell you, when I was first assigned this, I probably shouldn't tell you because it's just going to embarrass myself a little bit, but I had a complete just gap in my brain. And when I read Ruth, I even told Lawrence, I said, why are we talking about Ruth? That was like way in the Persian Empire. And he looked at me really funny, and I just knew I'd said something wrong. And he said, well, doesn't it in the first verse of Ruth say during the time of Judges? I said, yeah, oh yeah, I was thinking Esther. So I don't know why I get those two confused. Completely different women, completely different stories, but for some reason I got that mixed up. So we are going to be covering these three books. For those of you who don't know or have not heard, the elders and the teaching committee, which I'm not part of, but for the adult classes teaching committee, they completely revamped the schedule that we have for adult classes, and part of that was changing the Old Testament schedule of classes and what is taught when. This class used to be Joshua, Judges, and the United Kingdom. And in fact, I've taught it all three times that it was offered here. So when I saw that on the schedule, I was like, well, okay, here we go. And then a part of that was taken away. So if you are used to this class covering, because we caught in 2018, 2011, and 2015, I taught this class. And it covered Saul, David, and Solomon as the United Kingdom. So if you were prepared to be discussing that in here, we will not. We've added the book of Ruth, and quite honestly, that gave me a bit of a challenge working the schedule. Ruth, of course, being a very short book, and for those of you who have been in classes that I've taught before, you know I tend to be much more factual based in those kind of things, and so coming up with some additional lessons for that was a little bit challenging this time. This morning we are just going to be going over an introduction, and in fact for the first three classes there are going to be a bit of an introduction here. So if we just look at, first of all, who is teaching this class this time? Myself, obviously. I'll be the primary teacher here. Hopefully the other guys will be picking up more slack as we go on down the road. And then Josh Doris, kind of a funny thing. Last time I taught this class in 2015, I taught it with Jason. So 2 classes in a row, I get a Doris helping me here. And then, of course, Brother Jay Geyer, who's with us this morning, but typically is not able to be with us on Sunday mornings. He'll be teaching a lot of Wednesday night classes also here. So everybody should have a schedule, and I'm going to try to get this posted online too when we post the video. I'll find a place to add a link to that at the bottom there. But if we look at the schedule here, obviously today we are going over this introduction period, and you'll notice those first 3 classes, we're going to really do what ramps up to this. In the first trimester of this year, we were teaching Exodus here in the auditorium, I think it was, wasn't it? We taught Exodus here in the auditorium. And then, of course, over the summer months, I don't know when that was. I taught Exodus last in here, because in January I was teaching in the college age class. But then the books between Exodus and Joshua have been covered in the first 2 trimesters this year. So we are going to very quickly take 3 classes, do a little bit of introduction, and then just cover thousands of years of history in those first 2 classes just to ramp us up to where we're at. Because of course, if we're going to study these books, Ruth is not so much a book of history, although it is a historical book. It really is more about one person's story, as opposed to, of course, Joshua and Judges being the history of the nation for, roughly 450 years or so there. So we're going to catch up to what's been happening before we actually get into the conquest. And then you'll see there we have, roughly 10 classes on the book of Judges, the book of Joshua, all the way through the conquest to how the land is split up, and then Joshua's final comments to the people there. We will have a gospel meeting, which will not impact our Sunday morning class of the gospel morning meeting. Sometimes it does, but it will not. It will only impact our Wednesday night class. So October 27th, we will not have class because of the gospel meeting with Jeff May. And then we will jump right into the book of Judges, and we'll have again 10 or so, 11 classes on the book of Judges, and then we'll have 4 classes on the book of Ruth, and then after that we've got some, what happens next kind of stuff, just to go ahead and bookend what happened before, what the majority of our class, what happens in these 2 books, and Ruth is added in there for the time frame, and then what comes next will kind of prelude to what the classes will be covered. Now, those last 5 classes then are complete. We can throw those away if we need to. If we get behind, or if there's additional material that comes up during the class, let us know. If there's a topic that comes up that we don't cover in depth, definitely happy we can throw away some of that, what comes next, because that's what the next classes are going to be teaching, okay? But that will be kind of our buffer, is some of those end classes there we can easily combine or remove some of that. I always like to start every new trimester when I'm teaching with some basic ideas about some class rules in here. It's definitely, even though this is the auditorium and it can sometimes be a challenge, this is definitely a class where I want everyone to participate. Please feel free. Interrupt me, raise your hand. Hey, Scott, just blurt it out. I'd much rather have everybody participate and discuss things than for me to just lecture for 45 minutes twice a week here. And of course, I do want to remember, because this is the auditorium classroom, we want to make sure that this is a very visitor-friendly class. We should not in any way try to make people who have questions feel uncomfortable, or if somebody comes in and doesn't seem to know a lot about the books and asks a lot of questions, that's perfectly fine. We want to make sure that this is visitor-friendly, not only for the people that might come to class, because and let's face it, 90% of the visitors who would come here, unless they're visiting with a family member, would come to this class. Also, this is the class that we record and broadcast online, so let's just remember that in our comments and questions here. Of course, as always, the only stupid question is the one not asked. Please speak up. And as I already mentioned, our schedule is really only a guideline. Even if, for whatever reason, there are so many questions and so many topics that people want us to dig into in more detail, even if we don't quite finish all 3 books, I would rather that and get people's questions answered than try to stick to some kind of rigid schedule, okay? So just remember that schedule is just a guideline. We are totally free to change it as we need to cover topics. So what are we going to be studying in this class here? Well, this is a timeline, and I know it's way too small for you to read up there. Don't worry about it. This is a timeline which, if anybody would like a copy, I'm happy to provide that to you, that I put together 30 years ago? Man, hard to think 30 years ago this year I started Florida College for the 1 year I went there. But 30 years ago, I took a class on Old Testament history and geography with Dr. Roberts, and really changed my life as far as understanding some of this stuff and really got me digging into some of this history. And so this is a timeline that I built way back then and have expanded upon during the time here. And so we're going to be covering about the middle section of the Old Testament timeline. This still has highlighted accidentally the United Kingdom. We are not going to be covering that period. We're just going to be covering the time period between the Exodus and whenever Saul gets anointed king there. Which does mean we're going to cover in a little bit more detail than we typically would because he's not in the book of Judges, but we are going to cover Samuel and Eli because they were actual judges also, right? And so we are going to cover them. They'll have a class each after we get through with Ruth there. Okay, so of course, in the next couple classes between today and tomorrow, we're going to try to hit that first period all the way up through the patriarchal period and what happens in history there. We're going to mention that a little bit this morning as we get into the idea of creation. And then we would have the next period, which covers the Exodus and the wandering and slavery and all those kind of things. And then afterwards, we've got the divided kingdom, and then finally that last period of the Old Testament history, the return and captivity, and then the return from captivity. So we are covering the exact middle of the Old Testament in this class. Okay, so if we kind of focus on that, what we're going to be studying here are these two periods: the actual conquest, which doesn't take up a whole ton of time, roughly 45 to 60 years. We're not exactly sure just how long that conquest took, but not. If you read the book of Judges, it seems like it happened in a year, right? It's just very quick. All of a sudden, the entire land of Canaan is subjugated, and that is not true at all. It takes quite a good number of years for them to be able to actually take over the land in order to do that. So we'll be studying that section of the conquest. And then, of course, a large period of time. We typically don't think of this as being this way because the book is so short, but 350 years is the period of Judges, which kind of blows your mind to think about it, that Israel was in the time of Judges for longer than we have been a nation. Think about that. Okay. So a lot of time period to cover there, but we don't have a ton of details about things that happen. But we are going to get into that, of course, in depth when we get to the book of Judges. So one of the things that I always like to prep an Old Testament class with is this idea of why are we going to be studying the Old Testament? The elders have done a fantastic job of dedicating an entire Bible class tract to going through the Old Testament over the course of our rotation of classes. And why do we study that? After all, there are many people who avoid those Old Testament classes. In fact, I know of some Christians who go for years and years without making a serious study of any Old Testament passages. And there are some reasons for that, which we might cover in just a second here. And it's also true that many new converts are sometimes even discouraged from spending time in the Old Testament. Any idea why we might discourage new converts from studying the Old Testament in too much depth, or why we would not study the Old Testament so much as Christians? Yes, go ahead.
It's been used by some to confuse over certain issues and certain topics.
Okay. I knew I was in trouble when my hearing aids were dead this morning. Speak up one more time.
It's been used by some to confuse or to manipulate the study of certain topics.
Yeah, that's right. There are some topics in the Old Testament that are not very popular and can be confusing, right? How do they fit into the New Testament story? And it seems sometimes that how many people have heard that there's the God of the Old Testament and then there's the God of the New Testament? Seems to be much different in some cases, right? I mean, after all, the Old Testament is the eye for an eye kind of God, and the New Testament is turn the other cheek. Wait a minute, that seems to be two completely different aspects of God. How do we reconcile those two things? I will tell you also that some of the things we will find in the Old Testament, they're quite disturbing. Some of the things that God has his people do, that he actually commands them to do, definitely are not very politically correct in today's culture. And there are some things that happen to people in the book of Judges that really are not great, right? Okay? I remember, I don't know how old I was, but definitely in elementary school, and there was one of those after-school special shows that we were watching, and it had something to do with some people who were wanting to censor the books that were allowed in school. And they were trying to go through some of these very popular books that kids read in elementary school and say, wait a minute, these books have terrible content, there's violence and sex and all these kind of things. And of course, the very progressive teacher got up in this meeting and told of this story of a guy whose wife, he said, but a guy of whose wife slept around with other guys, and in retaliation he cut her up and sent the pieces of her to all around the nation. And then said, that story's in the Bible. Are you wanting to take the Bible out of schools? And while it was a bit of a distortion of what happened, it is true that we're going to find a guy in the book of Judges who takes what is called his concubine, but would be a wife kind of in our vernacular today. And because of some things that happened to her, not of her own violation, but he cuts her up into 12 pieces and puts her in the mail. I mean, good grief. You want to talk about vicious kind of story? That's actually in the Bible, and we're going to be covering it today. So, well, not today, but this class period. So sometimes I can understand why people would shy away from some of these stories and some of these topics, just because there are some things that don't seem to jive with what we find in the New Testament. But we're going to talk about a lot of those things. Of course, another reason that many people somewhat would avoid the Old Testament is the answer to this question. Is it possible to be saved, meaning is it possible to be obedient to Christ without studying the Old Testament? Well, I'll tell you the answer to that is yes. Okay? If all you had was the New Testament, you could read about Jesus' life, you could read about his teachings, you could read about his apostles' teachings, who he anointed to carry on his work after his death and resurrection, and you could find what is expected of you as a Christian. You could find guidelines for your life of how to act and how to treat people, the idea of baptism and what happens there, and forgiveness, and why Jesus is such a great high priest for us. And, oh, wait a minute, what's a high priest? And how Jesus is such a great sacrifice. Oh, wait a minute. What's a sacrifice? And why are sacrifices needed? And how Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Oh, wait a minute. What is that? So is it possible to be saved without studying the Old Testament? I'm going to say absolutely yes, it is possible. Everything that you would need to be a faithful follower of Jesus is contained in the New Testament. However, there's going to be a lot of things, and we'll list some of them. I probably already walked all over my future comments, but we're going to list some of them in a minute that you might not, well, there's no way of understanding, I guess I should say, without serious study of the Old Testament. And it is interesting, I usually ask this question, you don't have to answer, of course, but what is your knowledge of the Old Testament? How would you rate your knowledge of the Old Testament as opposed to your knowledge of the New Testament? I bet most of you, the vast majority in fact, would say that you have twice the knowledge you do of the New Testament as you do of the Old Testament, simply because that is what we study more. And I'm not saying that's wrong, not at all. And then of course you get the weirdos like me who probably, I'm inverted in that. I probably know more Old Testament verses by heart than I do New Testament verses. And it was funny the other day, Olivia asked for what are some of your favorite Bible verses on Facebook, and I think she was expecting some comforting verses, and I mentioned verses like Samuel hacking Agag to pieces with his axe and some of those kind of things. It wasn't, Nikki yelled at me. So, we are going to study the Old Testament, okay? Well, what are some reasons that we would say it's important for studying the Old Testament? Let's take a look at Galatians chapter 3 and verse 24. This is not one of the things that people typically read, of course, when we would talk about this, but if we look at Galatians chapter 3 and verse 24, it says, "So then the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under the guardian." Okay. Well, how did it guard us as humans? Because there, Paul is not just talking to Jews. How did the old law guard us and protect us as humans? Well, what did it tell us? Told us what God wanted us to do, right? Okay. When we look at this, one of the biggest reasons that I love to study the Old Testament is evidences of scriptural inspiration. If you look at the New Testament, the entire New Testament, Jesus' life, the Gospels only cover about 3 years. And then when you look at the rest of the New Testament, depending on when you think Revelations and some of the epistles were written, it covers at most another 60 years, right? By the end of the first century, what we would call the first century AD, the Old Testament is done. How many years the New Testament is done? How many years does the Old Testament cover? Thousands, right? We don't even know how long the Old Testament covers, okay? And if you want to talk about a place where we go to find that prophecies and predictions were fulfilled, all of those prophecies that were fulfilled in the New Testament, where do you find them? In the Old Testament. That's right, okay? So if you want to be able to read the story of Jesus and understand that this is not just a random set of events, sometimes you may have heard me refer to what people like to say the New Testament actually was God's plan B, because the people weren't ready for the true Messiah or the true coming of his son, so he went this other direction. You can't get that feeling if you look at the Old Testament. Okay, this was plan A, the plan that God intended all the way from the beginning is fulfilled in the New Testament there. Of course, we already talked about how controversial some things are in the Old Testament. So if you want to be able to discuss those things with others, what had you better do? You better study those things and be ready to talk about them. Of course, most of our kids' classes and most of the stories we learn as kids, where do they come from? From the Old Testament. Okay, so those are kind of those fun stories, which of course I think studying the Old Testament is just fun all by itself. And then as we mentioned, there are some things that you will read in the New Testament that the absolutely only way you can understand them is by studying the Old. Just a couple, okay? Anytime you hear Jesus say, "For it is written," or "you have heard," which he says close to 400 times, okay? Anytime he says that, what's he referencing? The Old Testament, the law, that's right, okay? Either a direct commandment in the law when it was written, or some of the other things that were taught from the Old Testament, okay? We already mentioned this idea of a priesthood. What does it mean to be a priest? What does it mean to be after the order of Melchizedek? Why are sacrifices required? Jesus constantly refers to the Jews, and Paul himself refers to the Jews a ton about relying on this fact that they are sons of Abraham. Father Abraham, or Abraham, is mentioned over 100 times in the Gospels alone. How are we going to understand that without understanding who Abraham was and what kind of life that he led? So when we start talking about some of these classes here, and we look at this history, what are some New Testament topics that in this class we are going to be covering? One of which is the first beginning of a kingdom on this earth. How many times does Jesus refer to the kingdom? A lot. Well, what is he talking about? Is it the same kingdom that we're going to find and that begins here, that Joshua really starts off on getting them a place to have, to call a kingdom, and that the judges are really the first attempt at some kind of national identity with the government and things like that? How does that work out, and what does that mean? We're going to see why in the world does man need guidance. I mean, after all, God could surely just give us a little bit of set of rules and leave us to follow that of our own accord, right? Well, we're going to find out what happens when God doesn't provide that leadership and that guidance, which I'll hit another one here, the leadership here. What happens when people are without spiritual leadership? What happens to that group of people? That's important here. And of course, in the book of Judges, we are going to see something that definitely repeats itself in the New Testament. We're just going to see a very physical manifestation of what often happens in our lives, this idea of the cycle of sin. Sometimes called the cycle of the book of Judges, because it just repeats itself over and over in the cycle in the book of Judges there. Okay? So what we're going to do when we look at this class, we're going to take two different approaches to the topics. The first one is we are going to be looking at a historical overview. When you study the books of Joshua and Judges, you have to study them as books of history. I mean, that's what they are. They weren't necessarily intended to be like, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. They weren't written to a specific group of people to address some of the spiritual problems they had. What do? Those two books just tell the story and leave you to draw some of your own conclusions. Of course, we do get some times like, Joshua basically becomes a preacher toward the end of his life and has some very direct words to say there. But all of that needs to take place in its historical view. So we're going to try to put things in their place. Some of these are very common stories that everybody knows, but where do they actually fit in the overall timeline? We're going to study some of these stories and some of these things on an individual basis, but yet also, how do they fit together as this cohesive picture of the Old Testament? Where do these things take place? When do they take place? We're going to study some geography. We're going to look at how that's important to some of the battles and some of the land. And especially when we have a whole class period dedicated to the division of the land. It's probably one of the most boring sections of the Bible, I'll tell you. If you just read through it, this land went there and they went there and they had from this river to this river. And you're like, oh man, who cares? Well, it matters. And so we're going to go over that in hopefully a way that's a little bit more interesting than just reading the raw text. Of course, I think it's also important when we discuss these things, and I will, at least when I'm teaching, continue to try to bring up what else was happening in the rest of the world. Sometimes when we, as Christians, study the Old Testament, we have quite a bit of tunnel vision. We only care about what's happening in the Fertile Crescent because that's where the Old Testament story takes place. We don't seem to care about the rest of the world and what was going on and what was happening elsewhere. But the Bible story becomes so much more enriching and so much more engaging when you can look at these things and understand some of the other things that were happening in the world. Because we do have a lot of that history. And again, this is way too small for you to see. I'm just trying to put up here as an example of these are all the other kingdoms that were going on during the time of the Old Testament. We tend to think of just a few we know, right? Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. What about all the rest of these? What was going on in Rome and Greece during the time period of the Old Testament? Sometimes we don't care because we only care about that when. Well, when the apostles went there, right? But it's important to know what was going on during those times and that there really was the rest of the world outside of what happened in the Old Testament. Some of this I hope you can read. I know it's really small, but some of this is pretty interesting here. And of course, I made it way too small on my screen to see. But think about, the Bible doesn't very often mention technology. But during the Old Testament story, technology changed tremendously. The Bronze Age came about. People started using bronze weapons. And then all of a sudden, later on, we get to where there's actually iron weapons. All the way down, and I don't remember if this one has a laser pointer or not. No. If you look on the right-hand side, that Iron Age begins right around 1400. Guess when that is? That's right during the time of Joshua. And so now all of a sudden, Joshua starts going up against these guys who have much greater technology. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean when we talk about that the Egyptians had chariots? Well, so what? Well, you don't understand what that meant, okay? Think about being armed foot soldiers with slings and farm implements going up against tanks. That's basically what it was. The chariot was the tank of the ancient world there, okay? But some of this, as you can read through, it's important to know. 3250, for example. In Egypt, they create paper for the first time. Why is that important to the Bible story? Well, how do we have the Bible story? It was written on something. Where did those things come from? When was the Sphinx completed? When was the pyramid completed? You notice there's 1,500 years of history of world events that I noted here before we get down to 2000. That's when Abraham was called, roughly 2000, 1950 to 2025, somewhere in that time frame, is when Abraham was called out of Ur. You know, that's about the same time mathematics were developed in Babylon. But you never thought of that. So here comes Abraham, who's leaving Ur, which is located where, by the way? Babylon. He's leaving this area that they're really codifying mathematics for the first time. Interesting, huh? When you think about it in terms of that world history there. Get down to 1750, Hammurabi's Law Code. Perhaps one of the most influential architectural finds that we've ever had. The first that we know of actually written down codified law, of course, that has the law given by Moses happened yet? No. That's not going to happen for hundreds of years yet. But yet Hammurabi's law code was put down on stone there, okay? The Hittite Empire starting in 1680, that for hundreds of years, scholars scoffed at the Bible because it mentioned the Hittites. It wasn't until the 1900s that we actually found I think 1940 or something like that, right? Is when we actually found archaeological references to the Hittite Empire. And all of a sudden people started thinking, oh, maybe the Bible's get some things right there, okay? When we talk about on the second half of the chart there, the Hittites conquer Babylon in 1595, stuff that we don't think about, but yet has a great influence for those kingdoms and how they influence the united and the dividing kingdoms later. 1580 and 1450, the new kingdom in Egypt, and this guy Amenhotep II becomes Pharaoh. How does the book of Exodus begin? And there arose in Egypt what? A new Pharaoh. What does the new Pharaoh mean? What happened to the old Pharaoh? Well, it's important that we understand that that wasn't just, okay, one Pharaoh died and the new Pharaoh was put in place. There was actually this humongous revolution in Egypt where the entire dynasty that had been there for 250 years is kicked out and a new one starts. And what does Exodus say about that? There was a new Pharaoh who didn't do what? Didn't know Joseph and didn't know what the Israelites, why were they so important? And now all of a sudden what happens? Oh, who are these people? We got to put them in slavery. Well, why did they do that? We don't understand that without studying some of these other events, okay? Of course, 1405, conquest of Canaan begins, roughly 1400 there. Joshua dies in 1380, much later than that as a really, really old guy. The Hittites are defeated by the Sea Peoples. Anybody know who the Sea Peoples become? The Philistines, that's right. Okay, so that becomes important to our story, obviously. 1195, the Greeks destroyed Troy. We all know that story, right? Did you know that happened before Saul was made king? We're pretty close to that time. Interesting, when now all of a sudden we can start putting these Old Testament events in a true historical setting and understand what was going on in the rest of the world. Okay? And maybe it matters to you, maybe it doesn't. I think it's really pretty cool. Then, of course, this class period, because this is not just an overview class, we have taken away that whole United Kingdom class period there, so we are going to try to slow down. And if you'll notice in your schedule, after every single book, we are going to dedicate a special class to really just take a step back from that purely kind of historical view, talking about the facts that happened, and look at some of those applications. How does that really apply to us today? What can we learn from that? And as tempted as I was to take the book of Joshua, Joshua is one of my favorite old-time heroes from the Old Testament there. Jay is going to be covering the book of Joshua for us. I will take the book of Judges, and then Joshua will be doing lessons from the book of Ruth. And we're going to take that step back and let's not look at the story from a historical perspective, but what can the story teach us? Okay. By the way, Joshua, one of my favorite people, because we don't think of it that way, but really, who shares his name? Jesus. Yeah. I don't know if you've ever seen it or not, and I'm not trying to promote this movie, but and it just went out of my head. What's that? The Passion. Yeah, the Passion, that's right. The Passion of the Christ. Got some great parts of it, some things that I think it gets terribly wrong. But in the very first opening scene, when they're trying to speak, of course we don't really know how ancient Aramaic sounded, but they try to say it, and they don't call Jesus Jesus. Anybody know what they say? Yeshua. That hit me like a ton of bricks when I saw that. You know, oh, wait a minute. We think Jesus, the way we pronounce it, we're totally wrong. Totally wrong. It was really Joshua, or Yeshua was the name there. Pretty cool. All right, so right in the beginning, we're just going to start talking off. We've only got 5 or so minutes here left. So just to real quickly hit some of the beginning here. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 2, of course, probably the most famous passages in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So when we talk about creation, from a historical standpoint, how old is the earth? Well, that's a great question. People today are going to try to talk to you in terms of billions. Some Bible scholars throw around the world what we call the young earth theory, 4,000 roughly. Maybe a little more than that now. 6,000 I think maybe it's up to 6,000 years old. Well, when did creation happen? The answer is we honestly don't know. And the reason for that is there were, in the 1600s, there were some monks who really took that Old Testament and for the first time really sat down with those genealogies and tried to figure out exactly how old is the earth, exactly when did some of these events happen, but we have a problem. And in fact, if you were to look at my timeline in detail, from creation, we see the story of creation, then we see the story of Adam and Eve getting kicked out of the garden, and then really the next story we see is this idea of the flood. And you'll notice that bottom line there, sometimes we represent this, if you're timeline people like I am, with those slash lines and a gap. What does that mean? We don't know. Exactly. Well, wait a minute. I thought the Bible gave us genealogies that tells us. I mean, there's entire chapters, right? And Adam lived on the earth for so many years, and he begat so-and-so, and then he lived another many years, and then he died, and then that person begat this person, blah, 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 blah. Okay? And it goes on, and we read it, and we go kind of mind numb, but we think that gives us a time frame, an exactly time period. Does it? No, it really doesn't. One of the things you have to remember whenever you're studying the Bible and some of those genealogies is they don't They were never intended to give us an exact timeline. They were intended to tell a family story. After all, Jesus is called the son of who? More times than the son of Joseph, son of David. Was Jesus the son of David? Yes, he was. But was Jesus born of a physical relationship between David and one of his wives? No. In fact, 1,400 years or so, right? Between David and Jesus. So it's very possible, in fact, more than possible, almost guaranteed, that some of those genealogies we read about in the Old Testament, when it says so-and-so was born of this person, that it sounds to us like it is an immediate telling us how long it happened. In reality, there could have been 1,500 years between there just as easily. It's an important fact for us to remember, okay? So of course, then we find Adam and his family living in the garden. The tree of life is there, allows them to maintain eternal life. The tree of knowledge of good and evil, which really gave them that independent thinking. Sometimes we call that they were given a conscience to understand the thing that really made us different from the animals there. I don't know about that. Sorry about that animation there. But we do see a key Old Testament passage, one of the primary passages that tell us about the theme of the Bible, this reconciliation between God and man. And that is there in Genesis chapter 3. We see the introduction of sin and the first messianic promise. Okay? Anybody know what that promise is?
3:15.
What's that?
3:15.
Yeah, okay. Genesis 3:15, where through the seed of the woman, right, he will crush your head, but you will damage his heel. Okay. We see the whole consequences of sin here, how the wages of sin is death, how sin separates man from God, sin separates man from his environment, sin separates man from his fellow man, causes constant stress between men. Sin is universal. We're going to definitely see these last 2 points in the book of Judges. Sin is recurrent, and it brings about a ton of social disruption, not just disruption in your personal life. Okay? I want to take just a few minutes and hit that idea of creation very briefly in this introductory class. All right, we have roughly 30 seconds before that bell is going to ring. Any other questions or comments that anybody would have before we wrap up? All right, on Wednesday, we will be covering that next section, which is basically from this idea of creation up to enslavement. Okay, we're going to cover that as history on Wednesday.